So in World War II, this is the map of Japan's expansion before Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. And obviously they've taken a big chunk of land from the Chinese. They've gone ahead and they've taken from French Indochina. But they had some of the resources they need, but they didn't have all the resources that they felt they needed. And the U.S. had gone ahead and actually had sanctions against them after they started to invade China and taken off a bunch of territory because they didn't want them to continue to expand. And also, they joined in 1940, they joined the Tripartite Axis, which was the Nazis, the Italians, and then also the Japanese together as a set of world powers. That obviously the Axis versus the Allies is what we're going to come as what's going to come as the important two sides in World War II. So this is where they were at, but the thing about it is that the Japanese were poised to strike Australia. They knew that they were going to campaign against Burma and into Burma, which is owned by the British, and Midway Island, because they wanted to control the Pacific Islands as well, and those were those airstrips in Midway that you could go ahead and launch other attacks off of. And all this, again, poised to strike Australia and eventually take that. And certainly this region here, the whole Dutch East Indies is where it was called at that point. So all these areas are in their mind. They just haven't gotten there yet because they have one big thing to take care of, and that's Pearl Harbor. Because Pearl Harbor was the central location of almost the entire fleet in the Pacific for the U.S. And this here was a very big surprise of an attack. The U.S. did not expect it to be coming. There's some debate as to whether they should have, but either way, they were not prepared for it, and they were taken very much by surprise. And the ships were all lined up neatly in rows for the Japanese to bomb and attack, and really it was done early in the morning, so a lot of people were not up. They bombed the airfields first so planes couldn't get up in the air, and then they attacked the ships and with lethal effectiveness. And the surprise attack, again, the Americans probably should have known something was suspicious, so something might have been coming, but they didn't predict it very well, and obviously because of that, thousands of people died, and really the day of infamy is the way it was quoted by President Roosevelt afterwards. U.S. ships sinking at anchor. They didn't even get underway. Some of them got underway, but a lot of them did not, and they just sunk right where they were. That crippled the harbor as well. Japanese carrier planes had some imagery of them as they're getting ready to take off. This U.S. fleet in flames, and that's what a ship looks like when it's sunk like that. The Japanese destroyed several battleships, or many of the battleships, or disabled them, but no U.S. aircraft carriers were in port, and that was hugely important. So particularly the USS Enterprise arrived the next day, and that things would have been very different if this ship was out of the fight. And instead it wasn't. So the British also, they didn't really know, they knew that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. They had actually sent ships to sort of intimidate the Japanese into a place close to Darwin, where in Australia, as a way of sort of protecting that area, and just as a way of blustery sort of show of force. But the Japanese immediately attacked, or almost immediately attacked, right after December. They attacked Dutch East India, the December 8th. They attacked Australia soon after that, in the middle of December. At least they attacked Darwin. That's one of the main northern parts. And so they went ahead and they blew up these two ships. And this, again, clearly showed that war had changed, because battleships were not as useful as aircraft carriers were after this. And the Japanese capture and control Hong Kong in the December 24th, 1941. So they're taking off wherever they can. By February 15th, 1942, they take over Singapore. 1942 to 1943, the Japanese are pushing out the British forces, and it ends up being guerrilla-style warfare, hit and run. But a lot of it is the British aren't used to fighting yet, and they will learn, because the British, they relied too much on motor vehicles. Japanese are on the verge of attacking India, and this has been hugely important, but the British are able to counterattack and at least keep them out of India. There's a railway that was built where Japanese forced civilian and military prisoners to work, and a lot of them died because of the labor. Bridge on the River Kwai, I think, is based on that, if you've ever seen that movie. And they tried to instead just control, the British tried to control certain pieces of it that were important, and they of the land, and the Japanese were never able to actually take Burma all the way over, which was a big deal because otherwise, like I said, India could have fallen too. This was through Burma, they were actually able to provide some support for the Chinese. It's a road through Burma, and you have to go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth because it's so steep. And this provides supplies for the Chinese who are fighting the Japanese themselves. In terms of Nanking, we've talked about this a few times. These are all skulls if you look closely. Japanese army, when it took over, basically did whatever the heck they wanted, and 300,000 civilian deaths, thousands of rapes per day, hospital patients tortured, just nasty, nasty stuff. Soldiers bayoneting people and shooting people at will, burying people alive, using prisoners for bayonet practice, just nasty, nasty stuff. There's a reason, like I said before, that this is still an open, festering wound on some level for the Chinese for their treatment by the Japanese in Nanking. So up until 1942, Japanese, unstoppable, possess a large amount of territory, but the problem is that the U.S. has not been sleeping. The U.S. has been preparing, other nations as well, but primarily the U.S. at this point. And also the British Army is retraining to fight in the jungles as well. And the U.S. builds more and more aircraft carriers, and that really helps it to fight. Just the American industrial resources are huge and much bigger than the Japanese. We go on a war footing, which simply means that you couldn't buy a car in the 1940s once the war was going on, because all the cars that were being made were Jeeps and tanks and things like that in the factories that were modeled for that. That was just considered to be the patriotic thing to do. And just that was a tremendous amount of things like buying war bonds, and just suddenly everyone's attention unite against the Japanese and the Nazis as well, because the Nazis declare war on the United States when the Japanese declare war as well. So these are the type of planes that were used. Supposedly they look like sharks because Japanese were afraid of them, but like I said, a tremendous amount of industry built into providing these new ships. Probably the most important battle, maybe outside of Pearl Harbor, in the war in the Pacific is Midway. In this battle, the fleets never see each other, but the airplanes do. And in the airplanes, the U.S. carriers are able to fight off the Japanese, and the Japanese loses 4 of its aircraft carriers, and the U.S. loses 1. And it's just a huge turning point because the U.S. was protecting Midway Island, which was an important airstrip on one of those very small volcanic islands that the Japanese were looking to take over, and it was a huge turning point in the war. This is the world's largest aircraft carrier, but it was not actually used very well. It was sunk pretty quickly, so it wasn't very useful. Japanese battleships are pounded to pieces by carrier planes, and just like before the U.S. ships were pounded and the British ships were pounded, the Japanese pound the ships as well. Their ships are pounded as well by the airplanes. Now the new role is that once you go ahead and can actually protect an area, and you don't have to worry about airplanes when you secured an area, the new use of battleships is to sort of bombard the defensive positions of people on islands. In particular, for this the USS Iowa firing off shells into a Japanese island an island that's occupied by the Japanese. And a lot of these were very small islands, and the Japanese fought extremely hard to keep them, as they realized every time the Americans took one island, it was a little bit closer to the Japanese mainland, and that would bring worse and worse situations, because there had been one bombing attempt called the Doolittle Raid, where bombers were fired off of aircraft carriers, but they didn't have enough fuel. They bombed part of Japan, and that was a huge surprise for the Japanese, but then they couldn't fly back and land on the aircraft carrier, so they actually crash landed in China. This was all part of the plan, but it was a morale boost on some level. But the Japanese really fought very hard here. And again, Iwo Jima, this is another hugely horrendous battle. People fighting to the last man in some cases. This is a U.S. aircraft carrier sinking. Japanese battles, the battles ended up being things like they started to use what were called kamikaze pilots. Kamikaze pilots were pilots that loaded up their aircraft with explosives and went ahead, and this was kind of a last-ditch effort to stop the Americans. They went and loaded up their aircraft with explosives and flew in and deliberately crashed their planes into ships, and with the idea of basically directing them to the most sensitive part of the ships, and that were really devastating in a lot of ways. And you can see here some of these St. Louis being attacked and sunk. This was a suicide torpedo. Again, I think it's something that you would go ahead and drive it into the ship. U.S. ships ablaze after kamikaze attacks. Really devastating. Another one here. Another one here. And you can see all the tracer fire because people did not want these planes to get by, and it was really rough for the sailors. After attacking Okinawa Island, this was another stepping point. Then they could actually launch airplanes off this and attack the Japanese mainland, and that was going to be devastating. And really incredibly hard fought again. More kamikaze pilots. And civilians getting caught up in the fighting as well. Having people hiding in caves using flamethrowers, tanks upside down. This is, again, other things here. But what changes the war and makes the war shorter significantly is the atomic bomb, and that we'll talk about in class more. But this was a bomb that was utterly devastating. It was secretly made, and you know about that somewhat. This idea of secretly made in New Mexico and then transported. The Japanese did not really know what was coming. This is one of those great ironies that the USS Indianapolis was went ahead and transported the bombs to the first atomic bomb to a place called Tinian, but then the Japanese sunk the ship on its way back, and it was a secret mission. So out of 1,200 crew, 900 survived the sinking, and then after 4 days, only 300 men were left because lots of them got eaten by sharks along the way. Waiting for 4 days, and people were being eaten by sharks. That's basically, yes, the worst disaster in naval history for the U.S. And this thing, Enola Gay, that dropped the bomb on the Japanese, that's what Hiroshima looked like afterwards. That was the little boy. That's the name of it. The Japanese did not surrender immediately, so soon after, Nagasaki was attacked too. And then they went ahead and unconditionally surrendered. The Soviet Union did come in, and after defeating Nazi Germany, they came in to try and help. Also, they were able to go ahead and put some pressure on the Japanese in terms of the area in China. But the Japanese surrendered on the USS Missouri, and this is what it looked like when it happened. This is the celebration over Tokyo Bay. VJ, Victory over Japan Day. And in the end, the Japanese lost 2.5 million people in the war. China lost 10 million. And there still is a lot of controversy in terms of that relationship. The U.S. atomic bomb changed the way people fought, and that's changed war forever.